We are church. We are redeemed and chosen, trusting in the God of love, the God of hope, the God of atonement. We are church. We believe in one way, one truth, one life. Devoted, eyes fixed on the prize, devoted to Christ. We are church. We put God first. We are like-minded people created in Christ for good works, made in the image of greatness, made to reflect the greatest love ever known. We are church, the light in the dark, the hope to the hopeless, a brand new start, peace for the broken heart, a love that has open arms. We are church. Not four walls. We are a body of believers following the call to know we are forgiven, the call to love without condition, the call to trust without division. We are church, a community with open doors, serving the poor, living for more. We are broken people with a united cause, an unbroken love in a divided society proclaiming Jesus is Lord. This is what we do. We don't judge, we don't hold a grudge. We are not perfect, but we aspire to love. We are church.
All right, I'm going to encourage you to go ahead and grab your Bibles. I want you to open up to Mark chapter 9. Now, whether you've got that in book form or whether you want to pull out your phone, today is one of those days where you're going to need to follow along more than normal. All right, I'm going to do something kind of different, and it's going to make more sense if you can look at it with me. Okay, so I'm going to encourage you to go ahead and get that. Mark chapter 9, go ahead and thumbnail, bookmark that. But we're going to start in this place. Are you familiar with the phrase, a house divided cannot stand? You heard that before? Has the idea of unity. It's something most Americans are familiar with. There's even a Latin phrase that you probably know that goes with it. It's e pluribus unum. I don't know. I don't speak Latin. But you've probably seen that one before too, right? Like you've seen it on the United States seal. Maybe you've seen it on some coins. It kind of first showed up on coins like in 1786. But what it just means, okay, this phrase just means out of many, one. Out of many, one. And it has to do with this idea that there were all these different states, all these different pieces, but they formed one something together, right? They were different, they were independent, but they were united to form something else, something different. So there's many parts, but really just one, because the parts are united together. And that phrase, a house divided cannot stand, it's something you might be familiar with from a guy named Abraham Lincoln. He used it in a speech in 1858. He was campaigning to become the next president, and he was talking about the division that existed among the states at that time. The states themselves felt very divided. There was a lack of unity, there's a lack of peace, and it wasn't healthy. Lincoln thought the nation would crumble if it couldn't come together. And this wasn't an idea unique to Abraham Lincoln. He actually got it from a guy named Jesus. Matthew chapter 12, there was this moment where Jesus had just performed a miracle. He'd cast some demons out of this guy, and the Pharisees witness it, and they see it, and they're not really sure what to think about it. They know they don't like Jesus, but this seems like a good thing, so they're trying to rationalize and reason in their head how this could possibly happen, and so they accuse Jesus of being a demon himself. They accuse him to be a prince of demons, and Jesus responds with this. He says, "Every kingdom divided against itself will be ruined, and every city or household divided against itself will not stand." Jesus is telling them, if I'm a demon, what am I doing by casting demons out of people? That's kind of my business. It doesn't make sense, right? And Jesus knew something that leaders had known for a long time. Division eats away at any group from within. If there's a lack of peace on the inside, it's going to eat away at unity, and it's going to inevitably lead to a higher vulnerability to the enemies on the outside. And enemies on the outside know this as well. They know that if they can create division within their enemy, then defeat becomes much easier to accomplish. It's a whole concept of divide and conquer. Maybe you've heard that phrase as well, right? A house divided will not stand, so a great strategy is to divide your enemy in efforts to conquer. And that phrase, divide and conquer, that's attributed to a guy named Julius Caesar who used that strategy to defeat the Gauls about 22 centuries ago. But he wasn't the first to do something like that, and he wasn't the last. History is filled with names like Attila the Hun or Machiavelli or Adolf Hitler, who all used propaganda tactics or war strategies to accomplish their purpose and their goals. There's a guy named Napoleon in the late 1700s during an Italian campaign. As he's trying to conquer that region, he goes into battle up against this army, and he's outnumbered by 20,000. But the army he's coming up against was made up of two different armies combined together to fight against him. And so he used a rapid advance and attack strategy that actually split these two armies apart, and then he was able to fight them separately, and he was able to win. But Napoleon, before and after this idea of divide and conquer has been prevalent, and it's not just about battlefield, but it's also in the way nations rule. For example, the Roman Empire had a practice where after conquering a local population, they would work to pit different groups within that population against one another, because they understood that if these groups were fighting each other, they couldn't unite to fight the Romans. It's easier to control them if they're going to fight among themselves rather than rebelling and fighting against the empire. And so if you can make your controlled masses rivals of each other instead of rivals with you, then you can exploit their division and prevent unified resistance. The British Empire did something similar. They even had a name for it. It was called divide and rule. And there's a policy that they applied specifically to India, where they cultivated rivalries between different principalities and ethnic and religious groups, all in effort to weaken the potential for large-scale rebellion. Lack of peace prevents unity. And if you can create unrest, you can create division. And leaders have known this from the very beginning of time. A house divided cannot stand. So Mark chapter 9. We're going to start at the very end of this chapter, and we're going to work backwards. It's going to be kind of different. That's why you need to kind of be able to follow along, okay? But we're going to start in verse 50, where it says, "Salt is good, but if it loses its saltiness, how can you make it salty again? Have salt in yourselves and be at peace with each other." The idea is that you need to be salty and be at peace, which is kind of fun, because we use that language a little bit differently today, don't we? If you're being salty, that's kind of the opposite of peace. But what Jesus is saying here is that you should have his flavor. And he uses that phrase salt and some other teachings of his as well. It's a common idea. We even looked at some of that here recently. But what Jesus is saying is that his followers should be like him. That we should do the things he did. That we should say the things that he said. That we should have his flavor in this world. And if a Jesus follower loses their salt, if we lose the flavor of Jesus, it's not something that's easily renewed. We should take on the character of Jesus and begin a life of practicing being more and more like him. But if we lose interest in that, it's harder to get back to a place where we can become that salt again. However, if we maintain our salt, if we maintain the character and the attitude of Jesus, it makes being at peace with one another much easier. Peace is just simply being in harmony with one another, right? The church, Jesus followers, we're going to get along better if we all act like Jesus, if we do the things that Jesus did, if we say the things Jesus said, and embody the character and attitude that Jesus had. We're more likely to get along with one another and be at peace if we're more like Jesus. But there's more at risk here. This verse is really simple by itself. But there's a larger context for this statement. Mark mentions the word salt, which at first doesn't seem to mesh with the word peace, but he's talking about salt mostly because of the verse that he said just before this. Now you should know that Mark is kind of like the gospel writer with ADHD, all right? He's all over the place. When you read his gospel, it's wild. It's just random ideas, random stories just being pulled in. It's not chronological. It's not working in a specific order or a time frame like he's trying to tell you history. Mark's gospel is kind of like he's sitting down with a journal years later and just kind of telling these random stories, random memories that he had, just pulling all these different things together. But like most people with ADHD, if you can ever get them focused, something really cool happens, right? And so you have these brief moments throughout his book where he gets a little bit focused and he gets an idea and he begins linking these different random stories together that will carry a common thread with them, each one linking to the next. And you can see him go on a run of stories that all have that common thread. It's not always random. And so we're going to work backwards through Mark 9 because there is a common thread. There's a link in each of these stories, each of these little ideas that he offers. And the big idea, the common thread, is that you need to be at peace. So Mark mentions salt in verse 50, and he says that because in verse 49, he'd said the word salt. Very simple verse. All he says is everyone will be salted with fire. That's the full verse. And it doesn't fit the verses before, and it doesn't fit the verses after. It's just kind of a random statement. It's probably an allusion to Old Testament sacrificial system with the Levitical priests, where they had this practice that they would take an animal that had been killed and they would sprinkle salt over it in an act of purification. And it looks like what Jesus is saying, and Mark is recording these words, it looks like Jesus' followers are going to be salted with fire. Jesus' followers are going to endure trials and endure fire and endure hardship and difficulty. And it seems like Jesus is saying hard times are coming and that the world is not going to be at peace with Jesus' followers, and so you'd better be at peace with one another. Life is going to be hard enough. You don't want to go it alone, and so be at peace with the people who are on your team. Now, if you go backwards in the text, this word fire that he uses connects us to the previous section, right? He mentions eventually the fires of hell. This is in Mark chapter 9, verse 42 through 48. And there's two big ideas. I can't go verse by verse here, but two big ideas from this section, starting in verse 42. He says, if anyone causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it'd be better for him to be thrown into the sea with a large millstone tied around his neck. And that phrase, little ones, is kind of interesting. He's referring to maybe something that happened up in a previous section that we're going to get to as we go backwards in this text. This moment when Jesus actually brings a child in amongst them and uses him as an illustration. But that word there, it can be much more broad than a child. It could be talking about just any believer. And I think that's kind of where he's going. And I want you to catch the warning here. This is so very significant. If your behaviors, if your words, if your actions cause someone to leave the faith, it would be better for you to have a millstone tied around your neck, thrown under the sea. Sounds like mafia stuff, right? And we're not talking about a small rock. We're not talking about a slow sink here, okay? Jesus is talking about something like a boulder, something that's moved by like animals, like livestock, to be able to grind grain. We're talking about a massive thing, about a massive rock tied to your neck. There's no struggle. There's no slow sinking. It's going to be quick. It's very harsh language from Jesus. And what he's saying is that you'd better be at peace with other Jesus followers. You don't want to know the consequences of choosing to be in conflict with people in such a way that it would cause them to walk away from Jesus. You don't want that literally hanging around your neck. Now, at the end of this section, verse 47 and 48, he says it's better to enter the kingdom of God with one eye than to have two eyes and be thrown into hell, where the worm does not die and the fire is not quenched. There's our link to the next section. And what Jesus is telling us is that sin is a big deal, and that it has the ability to lead you astray, and it also has the ability to lead others astray. Your sin has the potential to cause you to walk away from Jesus, and your sin has the potential to cause other people to walk away from Jesus. And so you'd better be at peace with other Jesus followers. You'd better take it seriously, because according to Jesus, one way or another, you're going into fire. It's either going to be the fires of hell or it's going to be the fires of this world. And if you are a Jesus follower, then you've decided that you would rather endure the fires of this world than the fires of hell. And so you'd better be at peace with one another, with other Jesus followers, so that you don't push people out of this community and into the fires of hell. You don't want that hanging on your neck. Now, the key connecting idea in this section with the previous section, as we continue moving backwards, is the idea of the believer. And it raises the question, who is a believer? And Mark tells a story, again, just previous to this, in verse 38 through 41. And he recalls the story of the disciples, and they see some other guy in the distance. And the guy is casting out demons, and he's using Jesus' name to do it, which sounds really cool, except that they don't know who this guy is. The disciples don't know who he is. And so they're not really sure that this is acceptable behavior. They're a little bit nervous about this. And they bring it to Jesus like, hey, is this appropriate? Is this the right thing to be happening? He's not really one of us, right? Because in their minds, this guy wasn't. He wasn't one of the 12. He wasn't one of those believers, right? So in verse 40, Jesus says, whoever's not against us is for us. Whoever's not against us is for us. And what he's telling them is, don't you dare push people away who are part of the family. Remember that millstone around the neck? Be at peace with one another. Don't create conflict out of nothing. Don't go looking for reasons why we should divide or why we should prevent people from being part of our group. Don't try to find excuses to exclude. Look for opportunities to include. Now, Mark remembers this phrase, for us and against us, right? And it connects, that makes sense because in the previous stories, we continue going backwards in this text. He had just covered some other story where there was division. Remember, this whole chapter is all about being at peace with one another, even those that you think maybe aren't with us. And Jesus says, no, if they're for us, then they're not against us. So in this previous section, Mark chapter 33 through 37, chapter 9, Jesus asks, what are you arguing about on the road? What were you guys arguing about there when we were walking? See, the disciples had been traveling with Jesus, and he knew the answer, and the disciples knew the answer. In fact, Mark, who records the story, tells us that they kept quiet. They didn't respond because on the way they'd been arguing, and they were ashamed of what they had been arguing about. They'd been arguing about who was the greatest. Not like Jesus, but among them. Like which one of us is the greatest. And so you've got Jesus' closest followers walking down the road behind Jesus, who, by the way, is getting ever closer to the cross. And they're arguing with one another. They're not at peace with one another. They were divided. A house divided cannot stand. They're picking each other apart. They're embittering one another. They're fighting. They didn't have peace. They're at war. They're in conflict. And so Jesus tells them, if anyone wants to be first, he must be the very last and the servant of all. And Jesus takes a child and brings it over in front of him, has him stand there. He takes the child in his arms, and then he tells the disciples, whoever welcomes one of these little children in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me does not really even welcome me, but the one who sent me. Doc last week talked about hospitality and being welcoming. To welcome or to serve, as Jesus highlights here. To be at peace. These are acts of bringing God into your midst. And the very people who knew Jesus the best, the very people who spent the most time with Jesus, were not at peace. And there's only 12 of them. And there was no peace. I want you to follow the progression of these stories that Mark tells from the first to the last. It starts with the disciples arguing about who's the greatest, and Jesus tells them to be the least. Stop fighting about who the greatest is and run to the back of the line. You should fight to the bottom of the pile, right? And then he takes this child and he places him in front of them and uses him as an example, and he's like, you shouldn't be fighting over who's in charge. You should be eagerly serving one another, seeing who's the least, who can be the best possible servant. Because when people are in humility, considering themselves less for the purpose of elevating the people around them, there tends to be peace in that, isn't there? So Jesus says, be at peace. And then the disciples are struggling because they see some other guy who's doing Jesus' work. Jesus tells them, hey, if he isn't against us, then he's for us. Stop looking for silly reasons to divide. Be at peace. Stop looking for reasons to separate. Stop looking for reasons to push people away or to prevent them from being part of his movement. Look for reasons to include. Be at peace. And then Jesus warns against actions and behaviors, the sins that would cause another believer to fall away, and he offers strong warnings and strong imagery. He warns about the fires of hell, and he warns about millstones around the neck because there's something on the line here. You've got to be at peace with one another, with other Jesus followers, because you don't want to have the fact that you pushed people away from God because you refused to be at peace with them hanging around your neck. You don't want the fact that you chose yourself or your desires or your wants or your hopes or your dreams, your opinions. You don't want that on your record, so be at peace. And then he says everyone's going to face fire one way or the other. You can face the fires of hell or you can face the fires of this world. He says you have an enemy. You have an adversary that would love nothing more than to wear you down. You have an enemy who would love to divide and conquer the church. And so you had better pay attention. We have an enemy all around us who seeks to destroy. And if we aren't at peace with one another, what hope do we have? So don't lose what you've been given from God. Don't lose your saltiness, the work of the Spirit in your life. Don't lose your growth and maturity that have deepened and developed in you. Don't lose what you have in common with other Jesus followers. Be at peace. And he finishes it off by saying, be at peace with one another. Because a house divided will not stand. Our enemy would love to divide and conquer. Jesus once said that the gates of hell can't prevail against the church, and it's true. It's true mostly because he said it, but I think he's also right. I believe him. But perhaps some churches fail because the gates of hell didn't have to get involved. We do it ourselves. We argue amongst ourselves. We fight amongst ourselves. We just find reasons to separate. We turn on one another. We turn brother and sister into enemies. And our enemies and the forces against us, they celebrate our division. And then they conquer. How dare we become our own enemy? It's so very hard to follow Jesus, and we make it harder for each other. See, I think peace can look like several different things. Lots of different places that we can go for this, but I think peace looks like an attitude. I think it's a mindset that says that there's room for disagreement, but there's no room for disunity. Peace is room for disagreement, but not disunity. And if you go to the Merriam-Webster dictionary to define peace, the third definition down that gets into these interrelational parts, right, says harmony in personal relations. I mentioned that earlier. And that's what we're talking about here, peace and harmony. And it leads to unity. Peace and unity are connected. Unity exists around a big idea, something significant and powerful that pulls us together. And it exists in all sorts of contexts and organizations. We could talk about the church, we could talk about your school or your family, your community, the town, the state, the country. We talk about all sorts of different groups that exist. We could talk about the different groups you're part of on Facebook, right? All of them driven in unity around one big shared idea. It's what pulls you together. It's what makes unity exist. And it's so big that it protects us from what pulls us apart. Because within those groups, you're going to find little subordinate issues that you will inevitably disagree over. Within whatever community you may be a part of, you won't agree on every point with every person. Unity is agreeing about what is most important for the sake of that group. Peace is about allowing those smaller disagreements to stay small and not interfere with the unity around what's most important. See, peace is refusing to let our differences separate us. As a church, we are united by the saving work of Jesus. That's what pulls us together. And that unity should be strong enough to prevent anything else from pulling us apart. Unity doesn't require absolute agreement. And peace doesn't either. Peace requires us to give space in the places that we disagree. And that mindset, that mentality, that peace doesn't require absolute agreement is an incredible opportunity for the church to shine in the world that we are placed in right at this moment. Surely you can see this. It seems like everything is an argument. Everything is picked apart. There is a bitterness and an angst amongst our world right now, isn't there? There's a desire to seek and pick apart every argument, every idea, every belief, every system that exists. Everything is being pulled apart. What would it look like if the church was made up of people who had things we disagree about, yet we remained united because we cared about something much more? In a world where disunity is the norm, the church would become a magnet for people seeking a place to belong. I found an article this past week from a guy named Dr. Shane Wood. I actually went to school with him. He's an old friend. He's a professor at Ozark Christian College, author, communicator, and just all around solid dude, all right? And he wrote this kind of a post, this article says, I Disagree was the name of it. And it's about the need for disagreement in the context of education, because he's a professor. But there's some lines in the middle that I thought were very significant and powerful for us. He says, in the coming years, I'm convinced the churches that grow will be those that know the power of disagreement, those courageous enough to invite differences, those who know how to disagree and still stay united in Christ. You guys catching this? That if we're a place where disagreement doesn't dissolve into unity because we chose to live at peace with one another, it actually becomes a powerful testimony that would draw people in. He goes on to say, nothing would shock a fractured and frantic world divided by even the smallest disagreements more than a community committed to learning through conversation, a community rooted in unity and not conformity, a community that perceives disagreement not as a battleground, but as an opportunity to humanize the other, to learn from the other, to see the other as really not other at all. It's one another language, isn't it? And he's talking about peace. He's talking about the ability that when we live in peace, despite our disagreements, it becomes an incredible testimony to the world around us. Church, our commitment to unity, despite the disagreements we have, is proof that we are different. It's proof of our love for one another. It's proof of the work that Jesus is doing among us. So can you Cardinals be at peace with Wildcats? Can you Flyers be at peace with Wolverines? Can you West Side Kroger shoppers be at peace with the East Side Kroger shoppers? You know that's two different cultures, right? You know. Can you Republicans be at peace with Democrats? And can you Democrats be at peace with Republicans? Can you hymn singers be at peace with contemporary worship singers? And can you youth be at peace with those who hold on to the old ways? Jesus once said, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called sons of God." Church, hear me on this, all right? Making peace is God work. Being at peace is being like God. When we bring peace into the world, we are doing things that God is doing in this world. And if you don't believe me, just go one more story further backwards in Mark chapter 9. You see, I stopped at the story with the disciples where they're arguing on the road, but that's not actually the start of this line of peace through Mark 9. It starts in the section just before that, and Jesus is talking to his disciples, and he gives them this little prophecy, and he says, the Son of Man is going to be betrayed into the hands of men. They're going to kill him, and after 3 days, he's going to rise. This whole line of stories that Mark puts out. Mark, remember him with the ADHD, right? Where he's just bouncing around. He focuses in and he pulls this string of stories in line where all of a sudden he's like this ultra focused and these different events that happen. He has this common thread running through, an idea of being at peace. This whole line of stories stems from this foundational piece where Jesus predicts his death and his resurrection. The foundation for our peace with one another is the work that Jesus did in his death and resurrection and that we celebrate in the Lord's Supper every single week. The Lord's Supper is, in fact, a celebration of the peace between man and God. It's Jesus' death on our behalf because we've sinned, because we were not at peace, and it caused separation between us and God, and it wasn't something that we could fix, and so God decides he's going to fix it for us. He's going to make peace with us by offering that sacrifice, by taking that first step, by taking the initiative, by taking the action to bring about and resolve peace so that we can be unified with our God. But it's not just about God and man. The Lord's Supper is an act of peace between brother and sister. It's an act of peace because we pause for a moment to focus on what we agree on, what it is that binds us together. In the book of John, after Jesus has instituted the Lord's Supper, he does a little bit of teaching, a little bit of talking, and eventually you're going to find him praying. And when he prays for himself, and then he prays for the disciples, and then he prays for us. He prays for the church. And a key word of his prayer is unity, that we would be one. He prays that we would be united, that we would not let the little things, the little disagreements about how we do things or what we believe, how we go about our politics or where we live or the color of our skin or any other thing. He prays that none of those things would divide us because of our unity that revolves around a crucified and risen Lord. It's what pulls us together. And so here in a moment, I'm going to invite you to the tables, which is a place of unity. And as we go through the motions of sharing in these sacraments, it's an act of peace that we go through. It's a small piece of bread and it's a small piece of, or small amount of juice, signifying his blood in his body, sacrificed for us, and it's an act of peace. As we take the Lord's Supper, we're at peace with our God, and we are at peace with one another because we are uniting by what is most important. So in this moment, we also give back because he's given to us, and so we give back to him. If you're part of this family, then you have a part to play in this moment. There's boxes there. There's a role that you play within this church to help, and so we give. And so those boxes that you're going to find at the station, that's for family members to be able to do their part. Sometimes we feel so blessed by God that we want to give above and beyond, and so we just want to give extra, and we have these white buckets on each station. That's kind of different. It's unique. But it's a way that we give even more, and we take 100% of what goes in those buckets to bless this church, people who need help in benevolent situations, and to help our community, to bless them as well. What we want to do is we want to bless others as we seek to make peace in our world. So I want to invite you to the tables. Let's go in peace.